we'll get straight into it. Um, so as we approach this conference, what would you say is the biggest challenge that smaller housing associations are facing right now?
I think continues to be resources.
Yeah.
So we're going into a new regulatory regime of increased expectations, rightly so, based around quality. The reality is, without that increase, smaller housing associations tend to have staff members wearing multiple hats, be it health and safety lead, resident and customer engagement lead, and with the increase in demand in those areas, but not necessarily an increase in the amount of homes you have or the resources. There's still a minimum level of resource you need to meet those needs. You know, health and safety is important whether you've got 1,000 homes or whether you've got 10,000 homes, as is the customer voice and that resident influence. So I think resources continues to be one of the main challenges.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of that kind of operating environment that leads to resources does come based on what governments do. Right now, especially after the autumn statement, we can see that political parties are starting to kind of gear up into election mode a little bit more. How do you think smaller providers should prepare for the next government, or potentially a very different looking government?
So whatever the outcome is of the election, it's going to be impossible to guarantee what either the existing or future government might do. So I personally think that represents a good reset opportunity for providers to do some soul searching, re-establish what their social purpose is and what their priorities are, because they're, you know, the regulator's right. There are going to be trade-offs that need to be made. And I think it's important to just, I guess, begin or continue reflecting on how those priorities might change based on various scenarios. And that could be through financial stress testing. But I think it's important to just normalize the unforeseen. You know, the perfect storm scenarios that people have been talking about were here, we're in a storm. And then, as I say, normalizing trade-offs. So at Mount Green's Board Away weekend, we went through an exercise as the executive team and the board team, where we deliberately had to pick some priorities amongst a list of, say, 9. And that really forced the kind of behaviors that are going to be important, I think, in these times.
That's really interesting. The National Housing Federation is currently campaigning for a long-term plan for housing. How do you think that smaller providers could benefit from, say, a more kind of long-term focused housing policy?
It offers certainty. So smaller providers are going to have less financial headroom to deal with, you know, adverse events or unforeseen events. And on one hand, the sector is being rightly so challenged to deliver quality services to existing homes. And at the same time, as we heard at the Audit and Risk Conference recently in Birmingham by the NHF, there's a challenge to also play a role in increasing housing supply to assist with the housing crisis. So if we want any provider to do that, but especially small providers, it definitely helps to have a long-term plan, because then you can start to plan accordingly. So if, as the data shows, the poor housing cost the NHS 1.4 billion, for example, if there's a long-term plan on the housing and the health side, it allows a small provider to work out what their appetite is for developing in order to help with that situation, build up the relationships that require that kind of collaboration. But without a long-term plan, you have a bit more of a risk-averse, prudent approach being taken. And if you think a lot of the development programs, there's relative tightness to some of the bidding deadlines for development or regeneration, but a long-term housing plan would just, again, allow people to take a bit more of an open appetite for developing.
Yeah, of course. And one thing we often learn at these conferences or other events that the NHF run is the sort of, I suppose you could call it intersectionality of some of these issues. You talked about the cost to the NHS there, the health service. There are other kinds of social and health consequences of kind of continued crisis. Moving on to the conference itself, what do you hope that delegates who attend the National Smaller Housing Associations Conference can take away from it?
So, as chair of the conference, had the pleasure and privilege of working with an advisory board around establishing the content. And I said I was quite keen to offer an array of and by way of an approach, so some inspirational pieces, aspirational pieces, sometimes just some reflective pieces that don't necessarily end up in a solution, but at the same time, some practical examples of what people have tried in different areas to take away. And I think we've done well, a bit biased maybe, but I think we've done well to achieve that. And we've got quite an array in terms of representation of speakers as well. So we've got the regulator and the housing ombudsman attending for some sector outlook pieces. And then even within the network, an array of different types of housing associations, urban, rural. And one of the things we also wanted to do is make sure there was a focus maybe on some at-risk groups. So we'll hear from the chief executive of a housing provider that specializes in housing for women, for example. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think what you've also alluded to there, which I find really interesting about some of our smaller members, is sort of the diversity of expertise that they bring in.
Yeah.
Maybe with that in mind, because it is quite a good opportunity when delegates arrive at this conference. What are the sort of attitudes or expectations that they should bring that will help them get the most out of this event?
So we're going through unprecedented challenges as a sector, but at the same time, that offers opportunity in that no one has been through the regime against the backdrop of the significant events we've had in the sector recently.
Yeah, of course.
No one's been through that. So that allows for a reset, new thought, diversity of thought, the experience of any of us that have been through something similar in the sector before, but also it opens the door for new ways of thinking as well, be that at board level, leadership level, for just innovative and new approaches, given that, as I say, no one can claim to have been through what we're about to go through as a sector before. So an open mind. And because it's virtual, I guess a bit of savviness in terms of engaging through the various digital tools on the conference on the day.
Yeah, and I definitely have some colleagues who'll be very glad that you said that last part. So maybe just to wrap up in a few sentences, why should the CEOs, directors, kind of chiefs, chairs, boards, and all colleagues at smaller housing associations be present at this event?
So I guess linked to my last point, as a sector, we're going to have to make some changes. Whatever we did before in the same fashion won't work. So the way to do that, in my opinion, is to collaborate with openness. And I appreciate this is more than 2 sentences, Will, but I think the conference offers a perfect space for that collaborative piece.
Well, that's absolutely fantastic. So Jesse, thank you very much for the chat. Really look forward to seeing you and everyone who's attending the conference.
Thank you. We'll look forward to seeing you and delegates as well, and the speakers, of course.
All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you.